with more than 70,000 fires across the region this year.
The country's Space Research Centre says the surge marks an 83% increase compared with the same period last year. Well, for more on this, let's speak now to Deborah Farias, lecturer in international relations at the University of New South Wales. Deborah, good to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
So an amazing number of fires, well, as listed, close to 73,000 fires.
It's almost unimaginable, even for me being a Brazilian. It's also hard just to sort of conceptualize this number. But to have a sense, the Brazilian Amazon, it would be the equivalent in size to about 2/3 of the Australian territory. So it's massive in terms of size, which means it's also, it poses a practical challenge in how do you confront all of this sort of illegal fires, illegal logging, just because of the sheer magnitude of finding out what's going on. So it's a very, very serious problem.
Do we know how the fires started?
They are intentional. So fires, even though it's very dry, this is sort of the dry season, and it's when a lot of these clearings happen, it is man-made. And what happens is, a lot of the times, is that you have first the clearing of the logs in the area, and that follows by especially the cattle ranchers. And what they do is essentially put fire to sort of clear the area, either for cattle or for any sort of agricultural plantation. Now, there are ways in which legally this can be done, but almost all of what's happening, I mean, from what the numbers that I saw, these are really illegal cases. These are not cases that have been authorized by the government.
Well, speaking of the government, so the president, Jair Bolsonaro, he says that possibly these fires have been deliberately set by NGOs working in the area.
Yes, with absolutely no evidence to that. So there is this sort of tension between President Bolsonaro and NGOs, and it's sort of a conspiracy-based idea that actually NGOs, especially foreign NGOs, are not really there to protect the environment, but they're actually, let's say, there to either have control of the Amazon, have our foreign governments control the Amazon, or sort of get in the way of the actual Brazilian government, so they sort of interfere with sovereignty. So that was put out there. He didn't specifically say, but he said, well, maybe this would happen, because the federal government did cut a lot of funds, or at least funds that were directed to NGOs. So he sort of threw it out there.
Okay, it comes at the same time that he has said that he wants to develop the Amazon for farming and mining.
Yes, and you have actually the Minister of Environment who recently said that he was looking forward to fostering, and I quote, capitalist solutions for the Amazon. At least to be fair and put it into context, I think any large country that has a lot of mineral resources, natural resources, in the case of Brazil, Australia, Canada, you will have this sort of tension about what you do with natural resources. So you will have those who see them as an opportunity for development in a very monetary sense, and others. And I think that's sort of the majority that's happening, even in Brazil, to say, no, that's not the priority. That's not the way to develop. But it is a tension that you see in a lot of countries. I mean, I see this in a much smaller scale in Australia, but in Brazil, it's just very visible because of the sheer size.
So with this land clearing that's going on, what's at risk in terms of global warming and emissions from the fires, as well as what the Amazon usually sucks up in terms of emissions?
Well, yeah, I mean, the consequences are global and they are dire. But what I will say also is that even in Brazil, this is something that most Brazilians don't want. They do feel that the government is going in a direction that is actually bad for the country. It's bad for Brazilians.
Because the smoke cloud has reached Sao Paulo.
Yes, and to have a sense of the distance between most of where the clearing is to Sao Paulo, it would be the equivalent of Perth to Adelaide.
Wow. Wow.
So it's really a huge distance, but that's how much smoke has been generated.
Well, it's not just the smoke and the pollution, it's also the loss of biodiversity, of course, in the region too.
Yes.
Do you know, a rough figure at least, how much of the Amazon rainforest has been cleared to date?
No, because also then you have debates about how you define the Amazon in terms of space. Where does the Amazon forest transition into a more like a savanna-like? But what I can say is that I was looking up the data to even compare to numbers here in Australia. And from January to August, so in these first 8 months of the year, just in new area cleared is the equivalent of 4 times the city of Canberra. So in 8 months. So it is massive. However, most of it does take place in this sort of arch of deforestation. It's not really deep inside, but it's essentially this space where you already have agriculture, where you have even different ecosystems, but you have a lot of agricultural production, and then it sort of pushes on these boundaries, and also where you have a lot of roads. Because then you can say you have an urban settlement as well.
Well, I mean, we're looking at some of those fires now, but is this a way that land is cleared traditionally in Brazil, that fires are set?
Old school, yes, because it's the cheapest one. And usually the process is, it's a sort of a gradual process. So usually what you have is, first you have, and all of this usually being illegal, is the illegal clearing of the logs. So someone goes and takes off the logs. And then you have that area that doesn't have the logs anymore. And then that area usually is either taken or sold or some sort of arrangement for people who then burn it to actually have either cattle, if it's a sort of a more, it's some proper soil, or you actually have it with smaller agriculture. And then afterwards is that you have, let's say, the bigger agribusiness that's sort of coming in. So yes, to answer your question, it traditionally it does happen, but it's something that's been fading out and that have been controlled since the mid-2000s. So things were getting better, and they began to get worse in the past couple of years.
So how does this situation get resolved? Other than, of course, it's going to take a huge firefighting effort to try and put these fires out, but in terms of the political will to find a resolution?
Well, that I think is one of the key questions in Brazil, is to sort of say, what are the buttons that could be used to pressure the president to actually take action? Because it's one thing to have the laws on the books, but you need to have people on the ground who are controlling what's going on to stop. And you also have to have the sense of people who are trying to do illegal things, that if they do get caught, they will be punished. So the federal government does need to show a lot of strength and a lot of determination. And so far, that hasn't been really the indication. There's been a lot of not just mixed signals, but just weird signals in a way. I mean, the government, the president said a couple of weeks ago that the only people who really cared about the Amazon were vegans. And
I mean, aside from pressure within Brazil, what about what's happening outside Brazil from neighbouring countries?
So neighboring countries, it doesn't seem so much that the pressure is with them. Now, what's interesting is that there's 2 elements of pressure. One that's coming from inside Brazil, and it's actually a little bit interesting and surprising, because you have these big agribusiness. So the people who are really big in terms of agricultural goods, let's say exporting soy, they are actually pressuring the government to do the right thing, because they know that they can get boycotted. So now I think one of the challenges is more about probably the threat on the pocket of saying Brazil is going to lose money, and we're probably going to lose, let's say, even an agreement that was made recently with the European Union. So I think that's probably the way of getting in the pockets and saying, look, this is not just optics, this is not just people who are green, but this has much bigger consequences.
Deborah Farias, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's been more